Gender is a concept that has evolved and been explored across a range of disciplines, including literature, anthropology, biology, sociology, and beyond. It is not a new concept, but its meaning and interpretation have changed over time. The term gender has migrated through decades, acquiring different connotations and developments along the way. It has a complex history and has taken on various forms in the course of its development as a critical term. Gender as a concept is often misunderstood. Many people associate gender with women's issues, but it encompasses much more than that. When discussing sex as a concept, we should know that traditionally sex was understood as the biological distinction between males and females, particularly regarding their reproductive functions, which extended to activities related to reproduction. Traditionally, when people theorized about sex, it was primarily seen in biological terms, focusing on these reproductive differences. However, it is important to note that this definition of sex as biological is not the only definition. In order to understand the concept of gender, there is a necessity to move beyond reductionist views that equate femininity and masculinity solely with biological sex. Instead, gender should be understood as socially and politically determined. This shift in thinking arose when scholars sought to differentiate between sex and gender, rejecting the reductionist view that equated gender with biological differences. In this new perspective, gender became a social construct, a set of roles and identities shaped by socio-political forces, while sex was logical. While the differentiation between sex and gender was a crucial development, there are certainly problems with such clear distinctions. Another concept to note is sexuality, which can be defined as a person's sexual inclinations and the practices that align with those inclinations. Sexuality encompasses an individual's sexual orientation, whether it is heterosexual, homosexual, or any combination of sexualities, and it extends to the behaviors and practices associated with those orientations. To clarify these terms visually, sex was traditionally seen as a biological concept related to the reproductive functions and activities. Gender, on the other hand, emerged as a distinction from biological sex, highlighting the socio-political aspects of identity and roles. Sexuality encompasses sexual orientation and the associated practices. These three terms, sex, gender, and sexuality, are central to discussions of gender in cultural studies. The differences between the sexes form the basis for the variety of human cultures which provide human beings with dignity and stature. In this view, sex, particularly sexual differences, is seen as foundational to human cultural variety. Cultural diversity depends on the distinction between male and female. Gender is often distinguished from sex, where sex refers to the biological identity and gender is seen as a social construct. Simone de Beauvoir states that one is not born but rather becomes a woman. This phrase encapsulates the idea that being a woman is not an inherent biological condition but rather a process of socialization. The category of woman is constructed through social processes, meaning that civilization and cultural practice shape the experience of being a woman. In contrast to Mead's focus on sex as foundational to cultural variety, Simone de Beauvoir emphasized that gender, particularly the category of woman, is constructed through cultural and social processes. Feminist critics, especially those concerned with gender politics, contest the humanist approach to literature and culture, arguing that it is rooted in male-centered patriarchal discourses. Luz Irigaray asserts that denying gender difference is a form of idealism, ignoring the reality of gendered experiences. The neutral, liberal humanist approach to culture fails to recognize the significance of gender and its impact on social relations. Adrian Rike critiqued the humanity trip, arguing that it is overly comfortable and impedes women's quest for full equality. Humanism, as a gender blind approach, fails to acknowledge the complexities of gender, sex, and sexuality. In this sense, the humanist approach is seen as naive as it overlooks the cultural and political implications of gender. In earlier models, sex was seen as the fundamental axis of social organization, leading to the subordination of women to men. In the context of sex, gender, and sexuality, power relations are always at play. Kate Millett argued in her seminal work Sexual Politics, patriarchy is not just an arrangement where men rule in the family or society, but is a political institution deeply intertwined with power structures. Millett's definition of politics extends beyond government and elections, encompassing power-structured relationships that permeate everyday life. The intersection of sex, gender, and sexuality with power dynamics underscores the need to view these categories not in isolation, but as part of broader political systems that shape individuals' lives and experiences. In the context of gender and sexuality, people often themselves playing multiple and shifting roles, which are not only tied to their responsibilities, such as rearing children, but are also influenced by societal expectations of gender and sexuality. These roles are dynamic, evolving with the changes in private and public life. Such roles are largely shaped by the entrenched norms of sexual morality that have been deeply ingrained in society. These norms seek to normalize sexual and gender lives, making them less diverse or ambiguous, preferring a more fixed and predictable structure of identity. This concept of normalized strategies can be better understood through Michel Foucault's ideas on the regulation of sexual behaviors in societal practices. Cavallaro points out a shift from the traditional narrow perspective that viewed gender issues solely as women's issues. The discussion now expands to consider the multiplicity of gender experiences, acknowledging that gender and sexuality are not just about one aspect of identity, but about various dimensions of human existence. Barker asserts that the study of gender is vast and touches on multiple domains such as sociology, anthropology, literature, and even the sciences like biology. Within cultural studies, the focus on gender extends beyond just examining its social implications and enters a more nuanced discourse about how gender interacts with cultural studies. Gender studies cannot be separated from cultural studies. They are inherently connected. Barker suggests that not all forms of feminism fit nearly into cultural studies, and not all areas of cultural studies are concerned with gender. This necessitates a careful examination of where gender studies intersects with cultural studies. He outlines several terms through which gender can be understood in cultural studies: power, representation, subjectivity, identity, popular culture, and consumption. By focusing on these concepts, we can explore how gender is shaped and understood in relation to cultural forces. Power refers to the ways in which gender is controlled and enforced in society. Representation focuses on how different gender identities are portrayed. Subjectivity examines how gender affects individual experiences and identities, and consumption looks at how gender influences our desires and needs in society. As cultural studies engage with gender, it is vital to use these concepts as lenses to analyze gendered experiences. Both feminism and cultural studies aim to challenge traditional established disciplines like sociology, literature, and they seek to produce knowledge that reflects the experiences of marginalized or oppressed groups. These groups, in this context, are those whose gendered experiences are often ignored or devalued, such as women or non-binary individuals whose voices are not typically heard in mainstream cultural discourse. We must look at how gender influences subjectivity through the discourses of sexuality. A key historical example is the medical discourse surrounding hysteria, which was once considered a female affliction. In the 19th century, hysteria was attributed to women's sexualities and was used to construct a particular subjectivity for women, one that framed them as overly emotional and irrational. Masculinities are inherently connected to femininities, emphasizing that they are produced together. Masculinity, particular global context, has been shaped by various historical phases such as colonial quest and globalization. These shifts have restructured gender divisions of labor and created masculine subjectivities that are deeply tied to global economic and political systems. The dominant discourse of masculinity prioritizes reason, control, independence, and distance, traits that can lead to masculine subjectivities associated with emotional repression, self destruction, addiction, and violence. These discourses shape men's identities and behaviors, linking them to broader societal expectations of masculinity. While these are not the only ways masculinity is expressed, they highlight a critical aspect of how gendered subjectivities are constructed within global systems. The Enlightenment, which emerged in Europe, was a period marked by the rise of science and technology. It introduced grand narratives such as Marxism, science, and religion, which were based on certain binary oppositions. Critics of the Enlightenment, particularly those aligned with post Enlightenment thinking, challenged these binaries. This shift in thinking is rooted in post structuralism and postmodernism, movements that sought to deconstruct these binary frameworks. Philosophers like Nietzsche, Foucault, and Derrida were pivotal in challenging the traditional ways of thinking, especially regarding gender. They critiqued the sex gender binary that had formed the foundation of feminism, where sex was seen as biological and gender as social. The rise of queer studies further complicated this binary by questioning the forms of sexuality and identity. Post Enlightenment thought problematizes the sex gender dichotomy by suggesting that biological truths are not inherently fixed or absolute. This idea challenges the traditional belief that sex is a biological truth while gender is merely a social construct. Judith Butler argues that the understanding of sex, gender, and identity can only be accessed through discourse, not by referring to an objective biological truth. This perspective does not deny the reality of the biological body, but rather critiques the way that biological truths are described. Discourse, according to post-Enlightenment thinkers, is a social construction that regulates and shapes our understanding of biological and gendered bodies. These regulated ways of talking about sexed bodies are not just socially constructed, but also monitored and determined by societal norms. Butler argues that gender is not identity. We often limit ourselves by identifying others as either male or female, but Butler stresses that our gendered identities are much more complex. Gender is an ongoing practice influenced by various discourses, but it is not completely defined or controlled by any one discourse. This undecidability is central to post-structuralism as it underscores the fluidity and multiplicity of identities. For Butler, gender is always a failure in the sense that it is not inherent to individuals, but rather constructed by social relations. Over time, these socially constructed norms have been naturalized, making them seem like inherent truths. Butler's critique suggests that the idea of a stable, fixed gender identity is an illusion perpetuated by social practices and representations. She argues that sexual identity is fraught with anxiety and that being a certain gender does not necessarily involve possessing a specific sexuality. Society often looks at markers of gender through behaviors such as dress, gestures, and speech. These markers are socially constructed, creating the illusion of a stable, abiding gendered self. In reality, sexuality can take many forms and may even involve non-sexuality. The social construction of gender roles through cultural markers like fashion and behavior creates pressure to conform, leading to anxiety over meeting social expectations. Individuals fear losing their gender identity if they fail to adhere to these normative markers. Butler also stresses that there are multiple modes of femininity and masculinity, suggesting that there is no singular way of being feminine or masculine. These various modes are enactable, but individuals may refrain from expressing them due to the fear of not conforming to societal expectations. The fluidity of gender and the idea that both sex and gender are malleable and changeable is a crucial shift in post feminist and queer theory. This shift rejects the notion that gender and sex are fixed, advocating instead for their fluidity and the potential for individuals to express themselves in various ways. For Butler, gender is not an innate identity but is instead produced through repeated performances of gendered behaviors. By performing certain acts repeatedly, individuals construct their gendered identity, and it is this repetition that creates the appearance of a stable gender identity. However, this gender is not fixed or permanent, it is continuously formed and reformed through social performance. Repetition, therefore, plays a crucial role in establishing gendered identity, but it is always an illusion of stability, not an essence. The shift from Simone de Beauvoir to Judith Butler is evident in the way Butler acknowledges the influence of de Beauvoir's The Second Sex, particularly the famous quote, "One is not born but becomes a woman." While de Beauvoir suggested that gender is a process of becoming, Butler adds her own interpretation. She agrees with de Beauvoir's idea that one is not born a woman but becomes one, but she expands the concept of becoming. In typical post-structuralist fashion, Butler argues that the process of becoming is never complete. The idea of becoming a woman or even a man is a process, one that is never fully realized. This aligns with Derrida's concept of deferral, meaning that the full meaning of being a man or woman is never fully attained because the concepts of masculinity and femininity, as well as male and female identities, are not fixed. They are fluid and change over time. Therefore, becoming a man or a woman is an endless ongoing process with no final destination. This mode of becoming applies to all gendered orientations, not just male and female, and it includes those who do not want to be confined by fixed gender identity. Sexual ambiguity, where one does not wish to identify strictly as masculine or feminine, plays a significant role in this idea of becoming. The categories of gender are fluid and marginalized, and they may evolve into various directions. Butler, building on de Beauvoir's idea, emphasizes that gender is a process in constant flux. She argues that woman is not a fixed term but is in process, an ongoing construction that cannot be pinned down to a singular, permanent identity. Gender, in her view, is a discursive practice that is always subject to intervention and resignification. This means that gender identities are not static, they are shaped and reshaped over time by both individuals and societal influences. In other words, gendered subjectivities are always in flux and their ultimate form is unknown because they are continuously evolving. This marks a departure from traditional views which often reduced sex to biological determinism. Through what is now referred to as the queer turn in gender studies, Butler pushes the conversion beyond biology, suggesting that sex is not just a biological fact but also a normative construct through discourse. The very concept of sex itself is redefined as a product of power and regulatory practices. Sex, beyond its reproductive function, has a productive power shaped by regulated through discourse. This regulatory power creates an illusion of sexual stability, but in reality it is a constructed ideal. Sex as defined by regulatory practices is not a fixed attribute but a stylization, a process that involves both conforming to and resisting gendered norms. This dynamic reshapes gender studies, moving away from older binary models where sex and gender were considered separate and fixed categories. Instead, Butler argues that sex and gender are intertwined, constructed and fluid, and they cannot be fully understood through traditional dichotomies. In her analysis of girling, Butler argues that the moment when an infant is designated as male or female at birth, this naming process, which shifts the child from it to he or she, is an example of gender interpolation. Through this act of naming, a child is brought into the domain of language and gendered norms. This girling process is not an isolated event but a continuous one, reinforced by various authorities throughout life. The naming of the girl sets boundaries for what it means to be a girl, reinforcing and reiterating normative behaviors and expectations. Butler's work, Gender Trouble, is revolutionary in its questioning of the very category of the subject. She argues that subjectivity is not an inherent fixed quality, but rather a performative construct, something that is enacted through repeated performances. The subject is not a pre existing entity, but something that is continually made through action. Identity, then, is not something one possesses, but something one performs. This performative nature of identity is central to Butler's argument that gender is not a stable, static attribute, but a fluid and malleable construct. This challenges the conventional understanding of identity and subjectivity, suggesting that both are shaped by societal expectations and regulatory norms. Butler's work creates trouble by deconstructing the binary oppositions that have traditionally defined gender and sexuality. She challenges those with the vested interest in maintaining rigid distinctions between categories like male, female, masculine, feminine, and heterosexual, homosexual. The questions raised in Gender Trouble highlight the instability and malleability of gender and identity, urging us to reconsider the assumptions that underlie our understanding of gender. The questions Butler poses, whether gender is something to be possessed or something to be, how gender is constructed, and whether gender can be constructed differently, further complicate our understanding of gender and its possibilities. These questions open the door to rethinking gender as something more dynamic and less rigidly defined, allowing for new possibilities in how we understand and perform gender in society.